Hey there, I'm Mattea Roach, and this is Bookends. I have never read anything quite like Everything and Nothing at All by Jenny Heijun Wills. It's an essay collection where the author reflects on her experiences as a transnational adoptee. Jenny was born in Korea, and she was adopted by a white Canadian family in southwestern Ontario when she was only 9 months old. She didn't look like her Canadian family or anyone else in her town, and she had always wondered where exactly she'd come from. Then, in 2009, Jenny found and reunited with her birth family. Now, I've known a lot of people who grew up as transnational adoptees, but I had never actually seen this experience reflected in literature before reading Jenny's work. Jenny previously wrote about her search for her birth family in her memoir, Older Sister, Not Necessarily Related. And now, Jenny's written a follow-up book. It's a collection of essays, and it's a finalist for this year's Hillary Weston Writers' Trust Prize for Nonfiction. In Everything and Nothing at All, Jenny reveals what happened since she connected with her Korean family almost 20 years ago. She talks about how writing and literature have helped her figure out who she is, and how she's built a family of her own here in Canada in a manner that's totally different from the construction of her birth family or her adoptive Canadian family. Jenny Heijun Wills teaches at the University of Winnipeg. She joined me in studio in Toronto. Hi, how are you?
I'm great. Thank you so much for having me. I'm super happy to be here.
I want to start off by talking about Older Sister, Not Necessarily Related, because I feel as though your two books are interesting in the sense of there's like a growth and shift in perspective maybe on your own experience that you see across the two works. So in Older Sister, Not Necessarily Related, you revealed yourself in the story of your adoption in this very public way. How did the experience of writing about something so personal and intimate affect you as a writer and just as a human being outside of your craft?
So Older Sister was sort of my first attempt at creative writing, not just reflecting on my adoption story. So it was the first for many, many things. And I think that it prepared me and galvanized me in a way to approach the subject in the way that I have with this current text. I like to think of Everything and Nothing at All as a sister complement or a sibling complement to that first book. And a friend of mine who had read both, so the draft of this current book as well as the first memoir, said, you know, the first book feels like something that's emotional, you're working through feelings. This one seems like one that you're coming with knowledge behind and with a surer sense of what you want to say.
I want to delve a little bit into sort of your personal story as a Korean adoptee and into the adoption process, because that's something that you wrote about in both of your books. So in your essay, Pretty, From Everything and Nothing at All, you mentioned that there's over 250,000 Korean adoptees worldwide that are mostly placed into white families in North America and Europe. For listeners who maybe aren't familiar with this story, can you tell us a little bit about the history of transnational adoption from Korea?
Sure. So transnational adoption, which, as you say, is largely transracial adoption as well, is one of the oldest, if not the oldest, program of institutionalized overseas adoption, in the history of the world. And beyond also Europe and North America, Korean adoptees also find themselves in Australia, all over the world, really. And it began, following or in conjunction with the U.S. war in Korea, and a combination of both post-war poverty, but also, what would at the time be called war orphans, or youths who had either been orphaned because of the war, or who had been born because of U.S. American military presence in South Korea. South Korea, like many countries, including our country of so-called Canada today, is extremely supremacist in the ways it thinks about race and ethnicity, and biracial children were not acceptable at that time. And so many of these youths were placed in orphanages, and there was a call, rather a demand, for U.S. Americans to so-called take responsibility for the biracial children children left behind. It initiated this program of overseas adoption that, as I write about in Everything and Nothing at All, still persists despite the fact that South Korea is an extremely wealthy nation, despite the fact that it has a lot of anxiety, I think, about low birth rates and population decline at this time. So this narrative of transnational adoption being a relief program is quite farcical in a lot of ways, I think.
You talk in your book about like this sort of rainbow family conception of people who want to, whether for humanitarian reasons, because they think it makes them look charitable, because they genuinely feel it's charitable, want to adopt across racial lines. And so, you know, there is this sort of weird, perverse incentive. South Korea is not the only country I've read about having this sort of thing. Like, you hear about it in terms of Ethiopian adoptees as well, that there's almost like a marketplace for a certain kind of adopted child, which is like kind of icky to think about, but important to talk about, I think. I want to talk, I suppose, about that demand side, if I can be so crass about it. How did that shape your identity?
I mean, I think you can very easily imagine the ways that Orientalism and fetishization enters the chat in these circumstances. So I was adopted in the early 80s. So, you know, Cold War still era of ideology. And so I think you can understand both the way that this yellow peril narrative of sinister dangerous hordes of Asians invading, and the model minority narrative. When scholars talk about those positions being two different sides of the same coin, I think you can see how it would play out in something like transnational adoption, where there are simultaneously sort of negative narratives about being East Asian or from, a so-called second world country in the past, but also this sort of desirability that is still also predicated on a dangerous Orientalist notion of self, of reduced, fetishized Asianness.
You talk in your work about sort of this pressure, kind of, I would say, coming from these dual narratives, right? The idea of yellow peril, of Asianness is something that needs to be kind of restricted. There's such a history of that in Canada. There was the head tax era. There was the Chinese Exclusion Act, and like the racism that Japanese Canadians faced, for instance, the internment camps that Japanese Canadians and Japanese Americans were placed in during the Second World War. Of course, you're not Chinese or Japanese, but I think a lot of these narratives get conflated together because people are not always historically good at distinguishing between different ethnic groups in East Asia. So there's all of that. And then there's this model minority pressure that if you want to sort of disprove that narrative, you have to be so successful. You have to be so kind of perfect and assimilate into white society in a certain way. Did you feel that sense of pressure, I guess, coming from your parents or society more broadly growing up? Like, how did all of that really impact the way that you developed as a person when you were younger?
Yeah, that's a great question, because I think the model minority myth, obviously in its clear anti-Black, anti-Indigenous qualities and its wedge group nonsense and its white centering nonsense. I feel that for an adopted Asian individual, plays out in a very particular way. So yes, in the broader sense of society, there's a narrative that exists that one is trying to either resist or find a way to navigate and make their way through. But in an adopted context, on top of it, there's the pressure of, whether it's false or not, this fear of being returned, of not being kept. And so perfectionism, or being perfect, takes on an additional layer of anxiety in those ways.
So I want to talk a bit more about your experience reconnecting with your Korean heritage and reconnecting with your, you say, first family. What was the process like with you deciding to find your first family? What made you want to go seek them out?
Yeah, so I was living in the U.S. at the time, which I think was a definite catalyst for that. I hadn't met many adopted individuals in Canada. And so being in the U.S. gave me a little bit of a push and normalized that experience of doing a birth search. And so it was a combination of saying, I'm researching these experiences in narrative for the academic work that I'm doing, but I'm not actually experiencing them. That's not to say that experiential knowledge is necessarily a positive thing in those contexts, but that spurred me on, and it was also a sort of coming to racial age, if that makes sense. I was reading so many books about Asian diasporic experiences that I was like, well, this seems to be the pathway that these texts are directing me towards.
What was it like to meet your Korean mother for the first time? Because that experience of meeting this person that you had maybe or maybe not thought about growing up, but hadn't been a physical presence, that I can't even imagine what it would be like. I can imagine that it may have been intense, but beyond that, it's so unlike anything I've ever had happen to me.
Yeah, it was incredibly emotionally intense to the point of paralysis almost. There are so many people watching. It's such a curated spectacle because, first of all, there's the linguistic sort of obstacles to overcome, and so translators have to be brought in. Social workers are there. There are spectators in ways that are quite shocking. So it was emotional, but it also didn't feel safe to exhale in those emotions. And I think the memoir was an opportunity to actually feel some of those things. This is why, these documentaries or these talk shows that sort of document adopted individuals or kin separated for whatever reason reuniting is it's quite troubling, I think, for a lot of people to witness, because it does turn something that's quite personal and quite emotionally weighted into kind of a carnivalesque.
Yeah, this sort of like society of the spectacle thing, that such a vulnerable moment is being broadcast and captured. And you mentioned, not crying and kind of this state of paralysis that you were in. And I can imagine why that would be, right? Because you don't want that moment that is so private and intimate to be seen by these social workers, translators, cameras, whatever's around you. Like, it completely makes sense that you would want maybe the time and the space and the process of writing the memoir to really like sit in those emotions, because it's so not, I think, comfortable for people to have emotions like that so publicly.
Absolutely. And if you can imagine the layer of having always been watched as a youth and always having people imagine narratives about you the second you go to the grocery store with your parents, the amusement park, anywhere, to school, that there's a sort of story that people are telling themselves possibly. There's a sort of version of yourself that's being seen, that's hyper visible. It's like, when is enough enough?
Right. I want to talk about the process of you reclaiming your birth name. So we introduced you today as Jenny Heijun Wills. So Heijun was the name that you were given when you were born. And you went through this process of first learning what it was, because you didn't grow up with that name, from what I understand, and learning how to pronounce it. What meaning does that name hold for you now? How does it feel to wear that as part of your identity?
So I grew up with it being my second name. So my, I guess, government name is Jenny Lauren Hay Jun Wills. So it had already been fractured in some ways by government documentation. It had been mispronounced my entire youth. And I learned how to pronounce it and what it was when I came across my Korean adoption file, actually, and knew enough. I know very little about the Korean language, but knew enough how to read my name, and then to hear it pronounced in the mouths of my Korean kin solidified a lot of those things. The reclaiming of it, I wish I could say something much more profound, but really it began with writing scholarly articles as, a Korean-Canadian individual, and wanting to be recognized as writing from within and not doing that sort of academic scholarly voyeurism and writing from the outside that way. And it was a way to claim belonging to that space.
I want to ask about the title of the new book, Everything and Nothing at All, because it's such a beautiful and poetic title to me. What does that phrase mean to you, and where does it show up in your work? Because there was a title drop in the book, and I was like, oh, that's the cover. That's the cover. I saw it.
Thank you. It's funny. I'm always hoping to write a book that has a short, snappy title, so social media is easier, all of those things. But they seem to be getting longer and longer and longer. The title came to me because I was doing an interview with a literary journal in the U.S. about the memoir, and it was an adopted individual who was interviewing me. And so I think that people in those contexts ask different questions, of course. And this individual was asking, what does family mean to you? What does blood mean to you? What does story mean to you? And I felt repetitive because to preface every answer, I was saying, it means everything, but it also means nothing at all. And so I think that this book is a reckoning with the idea that things can be both. Things can be nothing. Things can be everything, really. And that is the identity that one could possibly carve out for themselves.
Your essay, Not Just as Pleasure, describes your love of reading. And more than that, it goes into how literature really helped you understand your Asian identity. And I loved reading this because I had read sorts of similar things in other contexts. Like Alison Bechdel talks about this in Fun Home, reading queer literature being so formative for her. Can you tell me a little bit more about how engaging with this literature, maybe some of the books that were the most impactful for you, helped you kind of understand more about who you are?
Yeah. One of the things that I realized when I became a 20-year-old, or when I became an Asian person by myself, because that adoptee part of yourself falls away the second you're not hanging out with your parents when you're an adult, right? So you're just standing there, in my case, as an Asian individual. And I was like, what the heck now? I was able to turn to literatures beginning with some of those formative early immigrant stories to privately learn about what kind of things, not just my community, but, adjacent communities had experienced in what is now known as Canada. And it was through those texts I was able to learn about those pasts, also learn about some of the things that were impacting me that I didn't have language for, and being able to recognize those experiences in the words of others was extremely validating. One book that will always live with me is Kim Thuy's Rue, which I think was just made into a film or into a television show, a brilliant novel that really, it's a very different experience. It's a Vietnamese refugee narrative, but one that's also about dispossession, that's about how words and language can sometimes be the perfect thing for describing those feelings of disconnect, but also can sometimes be very insufficient. And so that's one example of a text that will always live with me, I think.
Another text you talked about was The Jade Peony by Wei-Sun Choi. And I loved reading you talk about this because I remember reading an excerpt from The Jade Peony when I was in grade 8 English class. And it was part of like a Canadian, mostly short story reader, I think. And The Jade Peony, for listeners who maybe aren't familiar, is set in 1940s Vancouver, and it follows 3 young children in a Chinese immigrant family. Can you tell me a bit more about your relationship with that text and also about your experience meeting Wei-Sun Choi? Because it sounds like you got to have this really profound full circle moment actually connecting with him as an author. I first encountered that book, or it was first shown to me in a first-year English course. I was at TMU. It was both devastating in the sense that I didn't know any of these things, and I knew that I was supposed to be connected to it because people had pejoratively been calling me all sorts of slurs for Chinese people my whole youth. And so I knew that I was meant to feel some sort of connection to it, and I did feel a connection, but I didn't know what that connection was. And so it became this meaningful text. It became, I won't sort of like hammer home the metaphor, but it was like this blossoming that happened within me and made me curious about this kind of writing. One of the characters in that text is a queer, intra-racially adopted youth also. So it was stirring all sorts of things inside of me at the time. But then years later, I did meet Wei-Sun Choi. I was a grad student by that point. And he was doing a reading. He had, I can't recall if he had published his memoir at that point, but he had also been talking about publicly about being
a late-in-life discovery of having been adopted himself.
Oh, wow.
Which is wild, I think. And I spoke to him about having also been an adoptee, having also been a queer individual, an Asian individual. And he said, you really need to write this story. And I've come to learn that he was always so generous and encouraging and beautiful to even non-writers, but also emerging writers, colleagues, etc. And I remember him holding onto my hand and saying this. And, it's one of those comments that you just sort of brush off. I hadn't been in Reunion at that point. It was before that. So I was like, okay, sure. Like, one day I'll do that. But it's really, as you say, become this full circle moment, because I did write about it once I had the space to fully process some of those thoughts. And it's with his brilliant editor, who I admire and love very, very much, who became my editor, as well as, from what I understand, a whole team of people that are now part of my life, that were part of his, and who miss him very dearly.
Yeah, I can see that really stirred some deep emotions in you, and it's like such a beautiful gift, I think, for someone that you admire to go out of their way to say that your story also matters and is worth telling. And I'm so glad for you that you got to have that moment of connection with him.
Yeah, absolutely.
You've said before that you don't feel that you have gotten in your life a singular narrative or truth about yourself as an adoptee. And it's always a bit of a puzzle putting together these different pieces of your identity, your Korean identity, your identity as a transracial, transnational adoptee in Canada, finding yourself as a queer person, perhaps in adulthood, discovering yourself through literature and all these things. Do you feel that in writing your own work, has that been a process of like agency reclamation for you at all, in sort of being like, this is my story, this is who I am and how I want to present myself?
Yeah, I think it's adjacent to that experience, and that is that creative writing has revealed to me that you don't have to have a singular narrative. You don't have to have a consistent character, that there are ways to live fluidly and to construct a version of yourself that doesn't necessarily cow to these kinds of expectations that pre-exist us. Writing has been such a pleasure to me. In many ways, I also wonder, and this is something I'm thinking through in a project that I'm working on right now, how much writing is a mask for a lot of things too. And so more to come on that. But I definitely think that writing has freed me from thinking that I needed to define myself in one way or in a consistent way. And people talk about, life writing as a narrative or as a genre of truth-telling. And I like to think of it as the genre of not lying. Because as an adopted individual, my birth date has changed. My location of birth has changed. The narrative of my coming into the world has changed so many times. And so part of me thinks that adopted individuals, or maybe people who have flexible identities in these ways, are the perfect people to be challenging our expectations of literary genres, such as nonfiction, because nonfiction doesn't have to have those kinds of strict boundaries on it. And when there's an individual who's like, I don't know when my birthday is today. It might be different tomorrow, and then it might be a different day like next year. It invites us to say, well, why do we expect that of this genre?
I think that's such a beautiful place to end things. Jenny, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me. This has been a great conversation.
Jenny Heijun Wills joined me in our Toronto studio. She's the author of Everything and Nothing at All. It's a finalist for the 2024 Hillary Weston Writers' Trust Prize for Nonfiction. This episode was produced by Lisa Matthews with help from Katie Swales and Liv Pasquarelli. Our senior producer is Jacqueline Kirk. Our executive producer is Aaron Balser. I also want to thank our radio techs and the whole CBC Books team. They make everything happen for us. I'm Mattea Roach, and this is Bookends. You can tune in on Sundays and Wednesdays on CBC Radio or follow the show on your podcast app of choice. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time. Because when the book ends, the conversation begins.